Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to show you another example of science-free climate science. The authors appear to have started with a conclusion and then just made up some ridiculous statements in support of it. Scientific American. The 1987 Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer effectively phased out the use of chlorofluorocarbons, a powerful ozone-eating industrial chemical, and the once notorious Antarctic ozone hole they created is in recovery. Eventually, the ozone layer is expected to return to its original condition. At the same time, scientists say the Montreal Protocol had some important side benefits. Without it, the impact of global warming likely would be even worse. That's because the same chemicals that cause the ozone hole are also potent greenhouse gases, shorter lived but many times more powerful in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. Recent research suggests that at the same time they were chewing away at the ozone layer, they were also helping to heat up the Earth's climate. A new study out yesterday in the journal Nature Climate Change has helped put their influence into perspective. The research finds that the ozone-depleting chemicals in the atmosphere may have driven as much as half of all the warming the Arctic experienced between 1955 and 2005. That is a powerful finding. The Arctic is the fastest warming region on Earth. Actually, it's no finding at all. It's just a bunch of junk science, as I'm about to show you. Here's the actual paper, Substantial 20th Century Arctic Warming Caused by Ozone-Depleting Substances. I'm not going to waste your time reading through the paper, but let's look instead at their key supporting graph. The red line shows the increase in downwelling long-wave radiation from ozone-depleting substances. The increase in downwelling long-wave radiation due to ozone-depleting substances is only 0.3 watts per meter squared. That's less than 1/10 of 1% of all downwelling long-wave radiation. It would hardly have any influence at all. Carbon dioxide is the dashed line, and you can see it has a much larger effect. And this chart doesn't even show water vapor. Minor variations in water vapor would have a much larger effect than the CFCs did. Basically, this paper is a joke. They can't account for a large increase in Arctic temperatures due to this tiny increase in downwelling long-wave radiation. Their claims have no credibility. And here's another junk science interpretation of that article from IFL Science. Your grandparents' old refrigerator helped contribute to a huge amount of warming in the Arctic in the latter half of the 20th century. Climate alarmists are absolutely shameless. They're saying that your grandparents' old refrigerator caused a huge amount of warming in the Arctic? How out of touch with reality would a person have to be to believe something that ridiculous? Then after their bold effort to instill generational hatred, they said that CFCs could be responsible for half of Arctic warming and sea ice loss from 1955 to 2005. Reading what these people said is painful, so instead let's look at some actual science. This is the sea ice graph from the 1985 Department of Energy report, projecting the climatic effects of increasing carbon dioxide. This report was the predecessor to the IPCC. You can see that in 1955, Arctic sea ice extent was actually at a century low. After 1955, there was a significant increase in sea ice. And this graph is from the 1990 IPCC report, and they show that sea ice continued to increase until the year 1979. In this figure, I combined the 1985 DOE graph with the 1990 IPCC graph. Looking at this graph now, it's pretty clear what happened. There was a lot of sea ice loss from the 1920s until the 1950s, and then a large recovery until about 1990. Now we're going to go back and look at this claim that CFCs caused half of the sea ice loss between 1955 and 2005. Let's compare this claim to the actual data. The right side of the graph is when CFCs were banned at the end of the 1980s. But Arctic sea ice extent increased the entire time when CFCs were in use in the Western world. Arctic sea ice wasn't declining as they claimed, it was actually increasing. Once again, the entire premise of this article is based on misinformation. But the story gets worse. Here's a story from the New York Times, October 19, 1958. The Changing Face of the Arctic. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half-century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust, on the whole only about 7 feet thick, over an ocean 2 miles deep. This delusion that there used to be thick solid ice in the Central Arctic is even more prevalent today than it was 60 years ago. Now let's look at what's actually going on with Arctic temperatures. This graph shows temperatures from Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. There was a lot of warming from 1900 until 1940, then a lot of cooling until the end of the 1970s, and then another cycle of warming, very similar to what happened in the first half of the century. Obviously, this warming and cooling is not being driven by greenhouse gases. September 29, 1939. Scientists have confirmed the fact that the Arctic regions around Spitsbergen are warming up at the rate of approximately 1 degree in every 2 years. Since 1910, when observations first started in those regions, the cumulative rise of winter temperatures has amounted to nearly 16 degrees. Here is a peer-reviewed paper from 2007. Current melting of Greenland's ice mimics 1920s to 1940s event. 1947, melting ice cap danger. If the Antarctic ice regions and the major Greenland ice cap should reduce at the same rate as they are at present melting, oceanic surfaces would rise to catastrophic proportions and people living in the lowlands along the shores would be inundated. This was the view expressed by Dr. Hans Ullman, noted Swedish geophysicist, today at the University of California's Geophysical Institute. Dr. Ullman added that the temperatures in the Arctic have increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from the scientific standpoint. This huge amount of warming was going on long before the tiny increase in CFCs. The entire basis of the paper being discussed in this video is complete nonsense. Climate alarmists want people to believe that the large amount of old, thick sea ice which was present in 1984 was typical. Red areas on this map show ice which is at least 5 years old. There was a lot of it in 1984. But in 1922 there was very little old, thick ice. Stephenson was one of the leading Arctic explorers, and he reported in 1922 that the ice between the North Pole and Alaska was thin, rotten, first-year ice. Thick ice was found between the North Pole and Svalbard, but between the North Pole and Alaska and Siberia, it was young, thin, moving ice. So in 1984, there was a lot of old, thick ice through here, but in 1922, there was very little or none. This correlates very well with the temperature graph. The late 1970s and early 1980s was the coldest period on record in the Arctic. And the coldest winters in U.S. history also occurred right around that same time in 1977, 1978, and 1979. There should be no surprise that climate alarmists pretend that they don't know anything about the warm Arctic prior to the late 1970s. These huge swings in Arctic temperature were not caused by a tiny 0.3 watts per meter squared change in downwelling long-wave radiation. Now let's look at what's really going on with Arctic temperatures. The red line in this graph is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, an ocean circulation pattern. The blue line is temperatures at Reykjavik, Iceland. As you can see, there's a very close correlation. When the AMO increases, temperatures in the Arctic do too. And when the AMO decreases, temperatures in the Arctic decline. Arctic temperatures show a very close correlation with ocean circulation patterns, but they show no correlation with greenhouse gases. This powerful new paper, as Scientific American described it, is a complete joke. The authors either didn't do any historical research or they chose to ignore it. The ozone hole isn't the topic of this video, but I'm going to mention it briefly. Last week on Anthony Watt's website, there was a guest post citing James Lovelock as saying that the current alarmist scientists' fraud was nothing compared to their lying and data manipulation in the 1970s during the ozone hole panic. James Lovelock was the father of Gaia and one of the world's leading climate alarmists, so he's certainly qualified to comment on this. And what is the end game of all of these lies? It's to create a generation of fearful, depressed, compliant young people. They're being very successful with their efforts. Young people like that are easier to control. But this child abuse is reprehensible, and I'm doing everything I can to help stop it. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.